All right, so continuing on at looking at media systems in other parts of the world, we're going to look at media in Latin and Central America. So this is a lot of different countries, as you know. It's not just a few different ones, but we're going to look at some more of the more controversial ones in this lecture. But as we look at media in Latin America, I kind of want to do a plug for the College of Media and Communication. I don't know if you know, but we have what is called the Thomas J. Harris Institute for Hispanic and International Communication. Um, Dr. Wilkinson and Professor Lucinda Holt are the two people that run the facility. And basically, they provide events and lectures and opportunities to travel to really just make you more aware of what's going on in Hispanic speaking countries, of the heritage of the media, and all those kinds of things that are related with it. And so check it out. Look at all of the things that they have going on and plug in if you're interested in it. They would love to have you. So, all right, let's get started at looking at some of the things happening in Latin America. So, the country with the worst press freedom in Latin America is Cuba. The country with the best press freedom is Costa Rica, and the most dangerous Latin American country for journalists is Mexico. So we're going to talk a lot about Cuba and Mexico in this lecture and kind of why it's so bad. But there are some good things going on in Latin America and other countries. That's why I wanted to share with you about Costa Rica. So, what are some threats to journalists when it comes to Latin America? Well, one, Mexico remains the Western Hemisphere's deadliest country for press. As of December of 2021, the Committee to Protect Journalists said that they had documented 9 cases of journalists killed in Mexico alone. And really, Nicaraguan officials have cracked down on expression. Basically, authorities started harassing and detaining journalists that oppose candidates or try to really bring the communities together with civil society organizations. And they're quickly making laws that criminalize any kind of critical expression. So it gives you kind of a, range of saying like, journalists are getting killed. It's a very deadly area for them. And they're really trying to criminalize anybody who tries to tell the truth or express an opinion of any sort against what's going on. I just want to show you this quick video. It kind of gives you an idea of everything and kind of sets up for the rest of the lecture.
We want to turn now to the Americas, where we look at stories coming out of the U.S. and across Latin America. Tonight, more bloodshed in Mexico. Another journalist killed this week in the country. 5 reporters have now been killed there less than 2 months into the new year. Sinclair Esamoah takes us to Oaxaca, where public outrage is growing and journalists are demanding protections.
Tonight, a 5th journalist shot dead in Mexico just 6 weeks into 2022. Eber Lopez, director of the news site Noticia Web, killed in Oaxaca on Thursday. The state's attorney general, Arturo Clavo, saying,
"We are already at 2 detainees, and there are also the guns with which they committed the crime."
Clavo says Lopez was entering a building in Salina Cruz when 2 people intercepted him and shot him. His murder now one in a string of Mexican journalist killings this year. Journalist Roberto Toledo's editor mourned his murder in January.
"We do not bring weapons. Our only defense is a pen, a pencil, a notebook."
Lourdes Maldonado, 68, was shot dead January 23rd in front of her house in Tijuana. Her family and friends demanded accountability at her funeral last month.
I hope that the truth will be transparent and they let us know what happened to Lupi.
On Tuesday, they got some answers.
It has not yet been possible to determine the motive.
State authorities say 3 people were arrested for her murder this week. The president of Mexico saying the slain journalists are not forgotten and that the government is investigating. But most cases involving journalist murders in Mexico do not end in arrest. At least 145 journalists were killed between 2000 and 2021. And the Committee to Protect Journalists says Mexico is among the deadliest countries for journalists outside of war zones. Now, Eber Lopez's colleagues demand more action.
Let's not wait for more journalists to spill their blood in Oaxaca, in Mexico, before you do something to stop the violence against freedom of expression.
All right, Zing Clay joins us now from 30 Rock Live tonight here on Top Story. Zing Clay, 5 journalists murdered in just 2 months into the year is pretty baffling. You know, what has the international response, and are the United States Senate, the U.S. House of Representatives, are they weighing in at all?
Yeah, Tom, it is really baffling, and it's not just the murders. The Committee to Protect Journalists said in addition to the killings of journalists this year, 2 journalists survived attacks and others reported death threats. But in response on Tuesday, we heard from U.S. senators, as you alluded to, from across the aisle. Senators Tim Kaine and Marco Rubio criticized Mexico's president and said the government has to do more to protect journalists. Tom?
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.
So just to give you an idea, in May, 2 more people were killed, so that brings the count up to 11. The latest victims were shot to death. Basically, they were activists, world leaders abroad, and they were trying to sound the alarm on issues that were going on in Mexico. So this is still going on. It's still an active thing. But what's causing it? Well, in Mexico, and in other countries in Central and South America, there are very ineffective and vague laws when it comes to what is illegal and legal for journalists to do and what is legal and illegal for authorities to do to them. Government officials really like to discredit journalists. Sometimes they do it by name. So you think about George Ramos was talking about the corruption in Mexico, how he couldn't speak out, how if he did, he was going to be in so much trouble. It was a threat to him and he wanted to do something about that. So he came to the US. There's a lot of unchecked police violence there. And there are a lot of digital hacking and attacks on journalists through accounts that they have or through websites that they're trying to publish through. And then, of course, political leaders and organized crime really work together to bring journalists and the media that don't agree with them down. In Mexico specifically, but throughout Central and South America, journalists, specifically women, are harassed, threatened, attacked, and murdered due to coverage on local affairs. Basically, anything that talks about political power, abuse, corruption, or organized crime, they are attacked about it because they don't want that information getting out. Many times, if there is a case that's brought to court, authorities don't do anything. They don't carry out adequate investigations to begin with. They just don't care. This is not something that they want to pursue. They don't care about these people. They want them to keep their mouth shut. In spite of all of this, a lot of Latin American countries say that they have constitutional freedom of speech for the press. Lucinda Holt, she's a professor in our college, did her thesis over what happened to journalists who were reporting on the drug cartels in Mexico. Highly interesting. I would encourage you, if this is something that interests you, to go talk to her about that. So what are some of the latest threats that are happening in Latin America to journalists? Well, for one, in Cuba, they are detaining journalists, blocking reporters from leaving their home, and they're trying to interrupt any and all access to the internet and social media platforms that they have. They don't want them to have access to any community to tell them what's going on. Also in Cuba, the government is really trying to seek out and tighten control over any and all digital spaces, specifically the internet and social media. In August of 2021, they put in new regulations on new telecommunications that basically said that um, anything that they didn't agree with online was criminal, and they tried to restrict the internet even more. Um, Journalists from 6 different media outlets in El Salvador um, received emails from Apple warning that attackers from the state they were in might be spying on them through their cell phone. So basically, El Salvadorian government officials were spying on them. And then overall, on the landscape of Latin America, there is a lot of dispute about what is good news gathering practices and what are professional values across the region. What is accepted, what is not. Should you keep your mouth shut? Should you tell people about the corruptness, things like that? When you look at social media in Latin America overall, though, even though there are a lot of restrictions that are happening, 97.5 of the internet users in Latin America use social networking like Twitter, Facebook, Google Plus. Overall, they have 179 million Facebook users, and that's 13% more than the US Facebook users. So think about that. They do have these restrictions. They aren't allowed to say certain things, but they have 13% more people using Facebook than we do. People in Latin America spend an average of 10 and a half hours a month on social media compared to US consumers spending only 5.5 hours. And Latin America overall has the fastest growing internet population in the world. So they are starting to really get connected, and the idea of globalization is really taking off there. Overall, a lot of the largest media outlets in Latin America have really grown and prospered, even though regulations have become more and more restricting. They're still seeing a lot of money come in, and they're seeing a lot of growth. The 3 biggest markets in the region, in Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, show a concerning level of concentration. In Mexico, there are 2 television companies that provide 90% of the national viewership. In Brazil, one group is reaching about half of the country's 200 million people. And in Argentina, there are 4 television companies that account for more than half the market. So even though this seems like they're really concentrated, there aren't a lot of options. When you think about other countries, even in the US, there are only 8 major companies that own all the media in the US. And then they have several other companies that distribute that information. So although this seems like it's very concentrated, that they are, very biased, only getting certain information, it happens all over the world, even in the US. However, how is media changing? Well, traditional media consumption is declining in Latin America. You're seeing a lot more people going to social media and the internet to get their news and information. In 2021, 22% of Latin American consumers said they read the newspaper. That was 10% less than the year before. 3 out of 4 Latin Americans listened to the news on the radio in 2021. That's 14% fewer than in 2020. And then 2% fewer Latin Americans users watch TV news. So that's not really a big dip, but it's still declining, right? But in 2021, 93% of Latin America's population were still watching television news. Basically, a lot of people are jumping on the trend of watching mobile video. When it comes to the internet penetration in Latin America, there are 73% of people with a peak in 2021 with 93% of people getting on the internet to look up information. And then Brazil alone had an 85% smartphone penetration in 2021. So that means that 85% of people own a smartphone there now. So it's been a big leap for them technology wise, becoming really involved with getting on the internet and sharing information. So that's why you're seeing the decline in traditional media, but you're also seeing a lot more restrictions coming in because people have access to more information, and the government and crime officials don't particularly like that. So basically, even though it is declining by 2%, television is still the most consumed and popular media source. Radio is dying, but it is the most dispersed among the population, so it's the most accessible. And even though everything is really being censored and looked over, the international media and whether they're sending information out or gathering it from other countries is really growing in Latin America. And you see that more soft news is becoming popular because advertising in Latin American countries is hard to come by for traditional news outlets. They're not seeking to spend their money there. With all these changes in technology, it also enables journalists to really try to publish more controversial stories online, maybe because traditional outlets that are owned by the government or organized crime officials won't publish them. They can go to the internet to publish that. However, when they are independent and they're trying to, publish the truth, they don't really have a stable wage. And they are also really creating this hostile work environment with those who do work in traditional media because they're not able to do that, and they are very controlled and told what they can publish. However, even though they can publish to a wider audience using the internet, locals really aren't looking for that kind of information. And so there's still a lot of censorship and media literacy issues when you think of the whole of Latin America. All right, so when you think of Latin America, one of the biggest and controversial countries you can think of is Cuba. When you think about Cuba and the media, their media is tightly controlled by the government, which is the Communist Party of Cuba, the PCC. And that control has gotten worse in the past 5 decades. The Communist Party really strictly censors news, any information and commentary that gets out to the locals, and it really restricts any kind of information being disseminated from foreign publications or tourist hotels. So they don't want information from the outside world getting in. If you are a journalist in Cuba, you must operate within the confines of the law. And if you speak out against the government in any way or say anything that could be anti-government propaganda, such as insulting officials or anything like that, you could get 3 years in prison to life. Really, what they're trying to say is that if you are a journalist and you don't really toe the line and censor yourself, you could be subjected to just an arbitrary arrest, the threat of imprisonment, persecution, and harassment. Your home could be illegally searched, and anything and everything that you have regarding any information that you want to publish could be confiscated and destroyed by the government. In Cuba, private ownership of broadcast media is prohibited. It's all owned by the government. And so you can't have any independent outlets. So kind of similar to China and North Korea. Cuba, of course, is ranked 177 out of 180 when it comes to press freedom. They are continually year after year labeled one of the worst media freedom violators. They are always at the bottom of the list. And their president, who was elected in April of 2018, is very authoritarian, has a socialist rule, very similar to his Fidel Castro and his brother Raul. So there's been no difference, even though they are no longer in charge. We used to not be able to send or receive anything from Cuba. There was an embargo there, but in 2016, it was reported that there was a reestablishment of diplomatic relations with Cuba. And basically meaning that Obama kind of opened the waters again to say, hey, we can, try to negotiate and be open to each other. This has kind of renewed hope for an end to the US economic embargo, which basically had a direct impact on human rights to Cubans. With the embargo against Cuba, it prevented American businesses and businesses organized under US law or majority owned citizens from conducting any trade with Cuba. And it is the most enduring trade embargo in modern history. The US really first imposed this embargo in 1958, and it's still going. However, in 2016, we have reestablished some communication and trying to open those lines. When it comes to press freedom in Cuba, the Cuban Constitution says that they have freedom of speech, but prohibits any private ownership of media. So that kind of is a contradictory thing, right? Cuba has less accessibility to freedom of expression and press than any other country in the Americas. So when you think of Canada, the US, and then South America, they have the least freedom of expression. Basically, they say that this restriction is to protect state security, protect the citizens. It's really just to protect the government and the things that they are doing that are really not in the benefit to their citizens. Journalists or bloggers who really act against the independence of the state can be sentenced to death. And the one law in Cuba's economy and their declaration, as you could think of, says that there's a 20-year sentence on those who commit acts aimed at subverting the internal order of the nation and destroying its political, economic, and social system. Basically, if you say anything against the government, you could get a 20-year sentence for doing that. And it could be anything that they think goes against any of those things. And then in 1997, there was this law of national dignity put into place that basically says members of independent news agencies, which send their information to other countries, can be sentenced to 3 to 10 years of imprisonment. Because again, you can't be an independent journalist in Cuba. An interesting thing with Cuba, and not just Cuba, but Latin America in general, is there is a role of the church and religion throughout the different countries and how it plays a part in the government and in the press. But specifically in Cuba, although the press is publicly owned, basically meaning that the government owns it, magazine and bulletins owned by the Catholic Church and other Christian denominations are also published. So you can get information from them. However, they are going to include religious instruction and news from the church and not really information that is beneficial to the citizens. Really, the church is seeking to expand to different forms of media, not just these publications. But Cuba says they cannot go to television, radio, internet, anything like that. When it comes to internet in Cuba, there are internet cafes that Cuban citizens can go to, but they have to give their name and address to get on the internet. Any material intended for publication on the internet must be approved by the National Registry of Serial Publications in advance. So you can't just upload something like a blog or anything. They did find that many foreign news outlet websites are not blocked in Cuba, but because of the slow connection and dissemination of internet use in Cuba and the outdated technology, a lot of people just find it impossible to load these websites. therefore restricting them even more. The government really relies on the fact that getting access to the internet or any other kind of telecommunication infrastructure is expensive. And so by making their public ones and these internet cafes slow, it restricts internet access. It restricts them from gaining information outside of what the government wants them to know. The government also knows all citizens' usernames and passwords in order to closely really monitor their emails, their texts, everything. In 2007, it became possible for members to legally buy computers. So think about that. You could legally buy a computer here in the late 80s, early 90s. It wasn't until 2007 in Cuba that someone could buy one. The government has approved Wi-Fi hotspots. In 2015, people were given unfettered internet access and access to social media sites such as Facebook and Twitter. However, any oppositional sites are blocked. So if anything came up on Facebook, that Twitter that was against the government there, they would be blocked. So I want to play this for you, kind of just talks a little bit about how Cuba is, the citizens are fighting for not just freedom with their information and the press, but other things as well.
It was a movement that started organically, out of pain and frustration. Calls for democracy and freedom in Cuba, unlike anything seen since the country's 62-year-old communist regime came to power. Calls spreading far and wide, led by a younger generation armed with something new: social media.
Do you think this movement could have happened without social media?
Not at all.
No.
Alejandro Gonzalez and Michael Rodriguez have become famous as Los Pichi Boys, two cousins turned social media sensation, with more than 500,000 followers who have been uploading videos to their Instagram account from users in Cuba so that the world can see what is happening, even when the Cuban government shut down the internet to keep images of protesters from getting out.
And the only thing that they have to defend themselves is the social medias. And they even cut internet so they can show out what is happening inside there.
This movement started on social media, and the young people from Cuba are tired of living under a communist regime where they don't have any future.
I mean, you all have really been doing the job of many reporters, getting information de la isla, from the island, to everyone here in this international community. Are you surprised by the level of feedback and engagement your social media posts have received?
Since the media and the press in Cuba is controlled by the state, they go out on the street in the morning, they do all the protests, they try to film most thing they can at 9, 2, 3, 4 in the morning. That's when they send us the videos, because that's when they have better signal. We go online every single day until 4, 5 in the morning talking to them. And yes, it's a big responsibility, but it's our duty. They made us famous. We need to make them free.
I went back to study and live in Cuba back when I was younger. And when you would talk to people, no one was public in their criticism. And so now to see people in the streets is something I could never have imagined after living there. Could you?
Yeah, never.
No, never.
I never, and you're saying that now, and I'm getting goosebumps. I always thought that Cuba was going to be free, but I never thought I was going to see it with my own eyes. And when we saw that on Sunday, we were in tears watching what was going on, because you can see an entire island rising up, chanting for freedom.
Those memories make you emotional.
Of course.
Why?
I'm a father. I'm a father. I have two kids, and I will give my life for them. And I don't know what's going to happen for me if I will see my kids like that.
That's why they're meeting with lawmakers to put pressure on the Biden administration, calling for change and a roadmap to help Cubans on the island achieve freedom. And they're not alone. Felice Gorordo co-founded Roots of Hope in Miami, and he says this generation and this movement calls for a new approach. His organization is raising funds and awareness to amplify the voices of young Cubans.
The young people who are the true agents of change are more empowered and more emboldened than ever before. And I truly believe this is the beginning of the end of this Cuban regime.
Why is the younger generation so important to this movement?
The ones leading this charge and that to a great extent have sparked this movement are our Afro-Cuban brothers and sisters. And they are artists that are using their art to inspire a new generation. They are not your typical politicians or activists. And I think it's our responsibility to help amplify those voices and make sure that they're not drowned out in this process.
And they say they're not stopping until everyone is free.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that.
Okay. So you can see people see that they are not getting the information that they need. They see they're very restricted as citizens and they're trying to do something about it. We'll see how that plays out. When it comes to social media, which is kind of where this revolution started, Cuba's government and has decided that using social media or the internet to start protest or insult the state is against the law. And basically, if your neighbor believes you're doing this, they can report you as an offender. Another communication minister signed a decree that says to prevent, detect, and respond opportunely to possible enemy, criminal, and harmful activities that could occur in cyberspace. Basically, they're trying to, quote unquote, protect the state, but they're just trying to restrict their citizens. This decree forbids spreading content that attacks the constitutional, social, and economic rule of the state that could alter public order. Basically, it targets messages that justify violence or that affect people's privacy or dignity. And this decree also bans cyber terrorism aimed at subverting order or destabilizing the country, categorizing it as a very high danger. They're really trying to keep their citizens under control and not let them get information out or get information that could incite any kind of protest against the government. And that means keeping their journalists controlled as well. So I want to share this as well.
Meanwhile, authorities in Cuba have blocked access to social media sites in an effort to quell the island's largest protests in decades. In a televised address, President Miguel Diaz-Canel denounced the protesters as counter-revolutionaries, blaming Cuba's problems on the long-standing U.S. embargo and accusing American imperialists of stoking tensions on social media. President Biden says the Cuban people are bravely asserting fundamental and universal rights and called on the regime to hear their people and serve their needs at this vital moment. Meanwhile, Cubans are facing a major shortage of food and fuel that experts warn could turn into an urgent humanitarian crisis. Michael Bustamante is a Latin American history professor at Florida International University and author of Cuban Memory Wars, Retrospective Politics in Revolution and Exile, and he joins me now for more on this. Michael, we've heard these protests described as unprecedented. So what makes them so unique and why now?
Hi, it's good to be with you. Simply put, we haven't seen anything like this in 60 years. The last time that there was anything remotely like this, you'd have to go back to 1994, when Cuba, sort of in the depths of its economic crisis at that time, after the fall of the Soviet Union, did see some sort of spontaneous demonstrations on the streets, but only in Havana. And what happened on Sunday was remarkable because it didn't begin in Havana, and it spread to a number of towns and cities across the island. So really the scale of the demonstrations is simply unprecedented.
And President Miguel Diaz-Canel spoke for 4 hours yesterday, condemning the protests. He seems to be offering no signs of backing down here. So where does this all go from here?
It's really hard to say. I was very distressed the way that Cuban authorities responded to the demonstrations on Sunday, calling their own loyalists out to the streets to combat was the word that was used, protesters on the streets, rather than seeking to de-escalate or demonstrating a willingness to listen to the demands of Cuban citizens that seemed to egg it on. Yesterday's long press conference seemed to be an attempt to kind of ratchet down the temperature a little bit. provide a detailed explanation about some of the ways in which U.S. sanctions do, in reality, make economic life on the island quite difficult. But simply put, blaming the United States, U.S. sanctions for everything that is happening in Cuba right now is inaccurate, and it seems pretty clear that for the citizens on the streets on Sunday, that's just not going to work. So where this goes from here, I think I'll just be watching to see whether the protests continue or whether the security sort of display that we've seen successfully, quashes them for the moment.
And so, Michael, you say blaming this all on U.S. sanctions is not accurate, but is there any validity to saying that U.S. sanctions are making this more difficult for Cuba?
The United States has had a program of comprehensive sanctions in place on Cuba for 6 decades, with greater or lesser intensity over the years, depending on the administration. I think we have to acknowledge that those sanctions do, make things more difficult for the Cuban economy. They affect Cuba's ability to do international banking. On the other hand, Cuba can still trade with other countries around the world. And so, this is not an either or scenario. What I would say is that, not offering some channels of relief, cutting off the ability of Cubans in the United States to send their family members remittances during the pandemic, which has been an economic crisis in Cuba in and of itself, that does have real effects on the Cuban people. But of course, the Cuban state has also taken some decisions, for example, a partial re-dollarization of the economy, that have really hurt the Cuban people. And so they have some responsibility to bear, certainly a lot of responsibility for just how dire this situation has gotten.
Many Cuban Americans are now calling for the U.S. to take action. What do they want the U.S. to do?
I'm not sure. Neither the Cuban people nor the Cuban American community speak with one voice. What I can say is that, I have heard on one sort of extreme some calls for, things as dramatic as U.S. military intervention of one kind or another. That's not necessarily a representative opinion of the majority in the Cuban American community, but it is a strain of opinion that I think is very dangerous. The last thing that we should be doing, if you want to support the right of protesters to be heard by the government, is to propose something that will feed into the government's narrative that this is simply a kind of a plot that's cooked up outside of the United States, in Washington or in Miami. Those calls are irresponsible. They're dangerous. And the smartest voices in Cuban civil society have been saying so. So I hope that those in the Cuban American community who are making those calls will listen to some reasoning here.
And we've heard experts warning that intervention could actually exacerbate an already urgent humanitarian situation there. Why is that?
The situation is urgent. Something needs to give. Cuba's economy has been hurt dramatically by COVID. It's an economy that's linked to tourism in a very important way. Cuba is going through its worst sort of moment of the COVID crisis itself in terms of the disease, after having been able to control it pretty well through the end of last year.
To get the idea, as of March, early April, the government had sentenced nearly 400 people to jail, some of them getting up to 30 years behind bars for anti-government protests. This is not going well for them, and it's not going to get any better.
Meanwhile,
so think about just, there are countries in Latin America that have great freedoms, and then there are places like Cuba that don't, Mexico, where it's completely dangerous. Just a mixed bag overall compared to other countries that we're seeing.